12 elite hunters of the Luftwaffe, the finest killers the Third Reich has to offer, are screaming through a fractured cloud deck over the burning heart of Germany. Their engines are a synchronized roar of mechanical fury, their gun sights are already locked on, and their fingers are tensing over the triggers. The target is a lone, silver P-51 Mustang, isolated and vulnerable. In any other story, this is where the American pilot pulls into a desperate, spiraling turn. This is where he banks hard, bleeding speed, praying to outmaneuver the swarm. But inside the cockpits of the Messerschmitts, the air is suddenly thick with a different kind of tension. Their radios are a chaotic storm of rapid-fire German commands and growing visceral confusion. Where is he going? Why isn't he turning? The silver target isn't diving for the safety of the clouds. He isn't banking to engage in a heroic dogfight. He is simply gone. Not a flicker, not a shadow. Just a clean, surgical disappearance into the distant, hazy horizon. The elite pilots of the Luftwaffe, men trained to anticipate every move of an ace, are left staring at empty space. It is a tactical ghost act that defies every rule of engagement in 1944. The farm boy from Iowa didn't play by the rules of the warrior class. He didn't try to outturn the Bf-109s or outclimb the Focke-Wulfs. Instead, he did something that defied every masculine, aggressive instinct of a fighter pilot. He outran them, all of them. And in that one calculated moment of defiance, Second Lieutenant Robert Buholtz cracked open a tactical shift that the Luftwaffe's finest air superiority fighters literally could not counter. This is not just a story of a pilot with nerves of steel. This is the story of how a quiet engineer's mind, forged in the relentless heat of the Iowa cornfields, solved the lethal physics of the air war. Before he ever touched a control stick, he was fixing threshers and tractors, learning that every machine has a breaking point and every engine has a secret. While the world was obsessed with the glamour of the ace and the glory of the dogfight, Buholtz was studying the math of survival. He saw what everyone else missed. He understood that the greatest weapon in his cockpit wasn't the .650 caliber machine guns in his wings, but the throttle under his left hand and the physics of sustained velocity. He was a mechanical analyst in a world of warriors, a boy who treated the sky like a laboratory. On this day over the ruins of Berlin, he would prove that the smartest way to win a fight is to be so fast the enemy never even gets a chance to pull the trigger. He was the Iowa farm boy who outran the wolves, a master of speed who turned the atmosphere into his personal escape route through pure logic and cold, hard, unshakable, mathematically perfect physics. Robert Buholtz was born in the middle of a line. In Iowa, the horizon is a razor, and the wind never stops its march across the corn. Before he dreamed of the sky, he was a creature of the earth, buried chin-deep in the heavy iron and grease of farm machinery. By age 10, Robert wasn't playing with toys. He was diagnosing the stutter of a failing carburetor on a rusted tractor. Every machine taught him that the universe is governed by inflexible laws. He learned that every machine has a voice and laws that cannot be ignored. While others read of aces, Robert studied the pulley and belt. He saw the world through the lens of an engineer. When the war came, he didn't enlist for the glory of the dogfight. He went because the machinery of the world had broken, and he was a man who knew how to fix things. Flight school in Texas was a shock for the natural-born men who flew by the seat of their pants. They looked at the cockpit and saw an office. Buholtz looked at it and saw a series of complex, interlocking systems. He wasn't the best at the feel of a turn, but he was the master of the manifold pressure gauge. He spent his nights under the dim glow of a barracks lamp, but he wasn't writing letters home or playing cards. He was memorizing the performance charts of the engine. He wanted to know exactly where the metal would fatigue and how much heat the cylinders could swallow before they melted into a useless lump of alloy. By the time he was assigned to the 357th Fighter Group in England, Buholtz was an outlier. His peers had painted pinups on their cowlings and given their Mustangs names like Calamity or Death Dealer. Buholtz kept his plane clean. To him, the P-51D wasn't a silver sword to be wielded in a gallant duel. It was a high-performance heat engine designed to convert high-octane fuel into forward velocity. He noticed things that the aggressive aces ignored. He watched the veterans pull their Mustangs into tight, gut-wrenching turns, bleeding off hundreds of miles per hour of energy just to get a snapshot at a fleeing Messerschmitt. He saw them burn through their fuel reserves in minutes of pointless maneuvering. He sat in the briefing rooms and listened to the doctrine of offensive engagement, and his engineer's mind recoiled. It was inefficient. It was dangerous. And most importantly, it was bad physics. He began to crunch the numbers in the margins of his flight logs. He studied the drag coefficients and the power curves of the German interceptors. The Focke-Wulf 190 was a monster in a dive, capable of rolling away from danger in a heartbeat. The Messerschmitt 109 was a demon in a climb, utilizing its light weight to leap toward the sun. But Robert saw the gap. In sustained level flight at 30,000 feet, the Mustang was the undisputed king. With the throttle pinned to the firewall and the engine singing at 67 inches of manifold pressure, the P-51 could sustain a speed that no German piston engine could match for long. It was a loophole in the air war. If you refused to turn, if you refused to play the enemy's game of circles and spirals, you became a ghost. You became untouchable. You didn't need to outshoot the Luftwaffe if you simply outran the very concept of a dogfight. He was a boy who understood that numbers do not lie. Robert tried to explain it to his wingmen, but most of them laughed. They were warriors, not mechanics. They believed in the bravado of the turning fight. They believed that running away was the mark of a coward, not the tactic of a genius. But Buholtz remained quiet, his eyes fixed on the horizon, waiting for the one moment where his theory would be tested against the reality of a German gun sight. He knew that the Merlin engine had a secret to tell, and he was the only one in the group who had bothered to listen to its mechanical heart. The wolves were out there, climbing through the cold clouds of the Reich, but the farm boy was ready to prove that logic wins wars. He would show them all. Numbers do not lie, and physics is the king of the cold sky. Always. By the early months of 1944, the sky over Central Europe had become a furnace of high-altitude attrition. This was the killing floor. A frozen, oxygen-thin battlefield where the United States 8th Air Force poured its youth into the maw of the Third Reich. Every clear morning, hundreds of bombers, B-17s and B-24s, rose from the airfields of England to form stacks that stretched across the horizon. Their contrails were the geometry of doom. Cold. White lines etched against the blue of the upper atmosphere. For every ton of explosives dropped, the price was measured in blood. The doctrine was a suffocating concept known as close escort. Fighter pilots were ordered to stay within sight of the heavy formations, chained to the slow pace of the bombers like dogs. It was a reactive strategy, a defensive posture that surrendered the vital weapon of initiative. When the Luftwaffe appeared, diving from the sun or rising from the industrial haze, the escorts were forced to engage in the enemy's terms. They were sucked into the furball, a chaotic vortex of maneuvering where speed was sacrificed for a tighter turn and energy was bled away in a desperate attempt to stay on a German tail. In these dogfights, the P-47 Thunderbolts and P-38 Lightnings were mauled, not because they lacked firepower, but because they were playing a game designed by the defenders for their specialized tools. The German interceptors, the Focke-Wulf 190 and the Messerschmitt 109. were predators. The Focke-Wulf was built for the heavy dive, while the 109 could climb like a demon, leaping toward the sun to reset the fight. The American pilots, trained in the tactics of the Pacific, were obsessive with glory. They would pull their Mustangs into tight turns until their vision grayed out from G-forces, unaware that every degree of turn was energy they would never get back. As they slowed to follow the German brake, they became vulnerable to hunters lurking in higher clouds who waited for fighters to stall. It was a cycle of death Robert Buholtz watched with the eyes of a mechanic. He saw friends vanishing into clouds, their fuel tanks running dry over hostile territory. While the 8th leadership struggled to reconcile losses, Buholtz was in his barracks, hunching over performance charts. He wasn't looking at the Mustang as a hero's mount. He was analyzing it as an equation. He charted the speed-to-altitude ratios, comparing the Mustang's power curves against intelligence reports of the Luftwaffe's machines. He noticed the gap, the tactical loophole everyone else ignored. The Messerschmitt 109 was faster in the vertical climb. The Focke-Wulf 190 could outdive the Mustang in the initial plunge, but in sustained, level flight at 30,000 feet. The P-51D was a different animal. Once that Rolls-Royce Merlin engine was dialed into war emergency power, the Mustang could sustain over 430 miles per hour in a straight line. It was a velocity neither the 109 nor the 190 could maintain for long before their engines tore apart. Buholtz realized the dogfight was a choice, not a necessity. If you refused to turn, if you refused to spiral down into the waiting trap, you could simply walk away. The concept of tactical disengagement was considered heresy in 1944. Fighter Command wanted aggressive engagement. They wanted the Luftwaffe destroyed. But Buholtz saw the fundamental flaw in that hunger. He realized if you can't be caught, you can't be killed. And if you can't be killed, you can protect bombers for the entire mission. He crunched the numbers on fuel, proving that a high-speed dash was more efficient than a 5-minute fight. He saw the geometry of the sky as energy states, not a duel of honor. To Buholtz, the Mustang was a ghost that could choose its reality. If the Germans came, you didn't need to outturn them. You just needed to be on the horizon before they could clear guns. It was a revelation born of Iowa cornfields and cold industrial logic, a shift from the warrior's ego to the engineer's survival instinct. He knew the doctrine was failing. He knew the furballs were a graveyard, and he was preparing to test a theory that would make him the fastest man in the Reich's airspace. The killing floor was waiting for dawn, and Robert Buholtz was ready to rewrite the physics of the air war, 1 mile per hour at a time. He watched contrails fading in the evening sky and felt the certainty of a man who had found the answer to a riddle killing his friends. The geometry of doom was about to meet the math of survival, and the Luftwaffe would never see it coming. March 19, 1944, began like every other morning in the freezing mud of Leiston, England, but Robert Buholtz could feel the weight of the mission in his bones. The objective was Berlin, the black heart of the Third Reich, a journey that required every drop of fuel and every ounce of nerve a pilot possessed. The 357th Fighter Group rose into the pre-dawn gray, their Merlin engines coughing blue flame before settling into a rhythmic, industrial thrum. Buholtz sat in the cockpit of his P-51D, the silver skin of the Mustang sweating thick condensation that froze into intricate patterns of ice. He was flying wing for a captain who viewed the sky as a place for glory, a leader who lived for the violent intimacy of the dogfight. They crossed the Dutch coast at 25,000 feet, the North Sea a wrinkled gray sheet far below. The cockpit smelled of high-octane fuel, hydraulic fluid, and the sharp metallic tang of oxygen. Then the radio crackled with the static-laden voice of the lead scout. "Bandits high, 11 o'clock." 12 Focke-Wulf 190s were climbing out of the industrial haze of the Ruhr Valley. Dark, predatory crosses against the pale blue of the upper atmosphere. They were angling for the bomber stream, looking for the easy kill. The flight leader didn't hesitate. He screamed the order for the break, and the American squadron tilted onto their wings, diving toward the Germans in a classic offensive engagement. But as Buholtz began his dive, something in his engineer's mind clicked. He watched the German climb. It was too steep, too choreographed. And then he looked higher, toward the thin, white glare of the sun. There they were. 8 more fighters, Messerschmitt 109s, lurking 2,000 feet above the main force, waiting for the Americans to bleed their energy in the dive. It was a classic bait and switch, a tactical trap designed to lure the escorts down and leave the bombers defenseless. Buholtz made a split-second choice that defied every rule of the fighter pilot's manual. Instead of following his leader into the slaughter, he pulled his Mustang out of the dive, leveled his wings, and shoved the throttle forward until the lever hit the metal stop. This was war emergency power. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine let out a guttural, terrifying roar as the manifold pressure surged past 67 inches. The engine began to consume its own life, burning through its coolant and metal for a few minutes of impossible velocity. Buholtz wasn't turning, he wasn't dodging, he was pinning the needle to the firewall. The airspeed indicator swept past 380, 400, and settled at a terrifying 430 miles per hour. Behind him, the German hunters in the upper group realized they had been spotted and rolled into pursuit. They had the altitude advantage and the weight of gravity on their side, and they believed the lone Mustang was a clean, easy kill. In his mirror, Buholtz could see the dark shapes of the Messerschmitts growing larger, their noses beginning to flicker with the rhythmic fire of their cannons. Tracers, bright pyrotechnic arcs of red and orange, began to zip past his canopy like deadly fireflies. The airframe began to vibrate with a violent rhythmic buzzing, the rivets under the silver skin screaming under the extreme stress of the slipstream. Buholtz didn't jink, he didn't weave, because every degree of turn was a degree of speed sacrificed to the air. He stayed straight and level. His eyes locked on the temperature gauges that were creeping deep into the red zone. He was betting his life on the Iowa-taught mechanics of the Merlin engine, praying the metal would hold just a few seconds longer. He remembered the threshers back on the farm, the smell of hot grease, and the way a machine tells you when it is at its limit. Behind him, the German pilots were pushing their throttles into the red as well, but they were hitting a physical wall. Their aircraft were built for the quick climb and the rapid roll, but they could not maintain the sustained, flat-out sprint of a Mustang at 30,000 feet. Yard by yard, the distance began to open. First 100 yards, then 300, then 500. The tracers that had been snapping past his ears were now falling short, becoming harmless arcs of fire that vanished into the gray cloud layer below. For 5 agonizing minutes, Buholtz lived on the razor's edge of mechanical catastrophe. The engine cowling was beginning to blister from the intense heat of the Merlin, and the smell of scorching oil filled the cockpit. But he was winning the race. One by one, the German hunters realized the futility of the chase. They were burning fuel they desperately needed to return to their bases, and their firing solutions had degraded into nothingness. In his mirror, Buholtz watched as the dark crosses peeled away, breaking their formation to return to the earth in frustration and disbelief. Alone in the empty, silent sky, Buholtz finally eased the throttle back, feeling the aircraft exhale as the manifold pressure dropped and the metal began to contract. He had outpaced death, he had outrun the wolves, and he had provided the first undeniable proof for a theory that would rewrite the sky. He was a ghost on the horizon, leaving a straight white contrail across the heart of the Reich, proving that the smartest way to win a fight is to be so fast the enemy never even gets the chance to pull the trigger. He wasn't a hero in the traditional sense, but he was a survivor who had mastered the lethal physics of the air war through pure, cold logic. Robert Buholtz brought the Mustang back to the Earth 90 minutes after the German crosses had faded into the haze of the Reich. The wheels kissed the muddy runway at Leiston, a chirping sound of mechanical relief, as the aircraft settled onto its gear and taxied toward the hangars. The crew chief, a man who knew the sound of a healthy Merlin engine better than his wife's voice, stood frozen as the silver P-51 reached its hard stand. The prop finally stilled. The silence was heavy, broken only by the sharp metallic pings of the cooling alloy. The crew chief walked to the nose and ran a grease-stained hand over the engine cowling, his eyes wide with a mixture of professional awe and genuine terror. The paint was blistered and blackened, scorched by the friction and heat of those 5 minutes at the absolute limit of war emergency power. Deep oil streaks, dark and visceral, ran the length of the silver fuselage like the desperate tears of a machine pushed far beyond the laws of its own industrial design. Buholtz climbed out slowly, his flight suit soaked through with the cold sweat of a man who had stared into the void and chose to run. His hands were shaking, a delayed reaction to the adrenaline that had sustained him at 430 miles per hour, while death trailed inches behind his tail. He didn't look like a hero. He looked like a weary man who had just survived a high-speed collision. In the intelligence debriefing, he was characteristically economical with his words, his voice a flat monotone. He didn't speak of glory or the thrill of the chase. He spoke of manifold pressure, cylinder head temperatures, and the specific moment the German firing solutions degraded into nothingness. He reported the 12 interceptors, the split-second decision to level his wings, and the pursuit that failed to catch him. The intelligence officer wrote it down, his pen scratching against paper in the quiet room, recording a set of facts that would soon shatter the existing dogma of the air war forever. By evening, the story had permeated every corner of the 357th Fighter Group like a slow-burning fuse. In the smoky darkness of the officers' club, the debate was fierce, fractured, and deeply personal. Some of the old guard, men raised on aggressive doctrines of the First World War and close-quarters violence of North Africa, whispered the word cowardice in the shadows. They believed a fighter pilot's job was to turn, to engage, and to die if necessary in a noble spiral of fire and steel. They saw Buholtz's run as a total abdication of the warrior's sacred duty. But younger pilots, the ones who had watched their wingmen vanish into the furballs of the winter, saw something else entirely. They saw brilliance. They saw the cold, hard logic of a survivor who had found a way to win without dying in the mud. Within 2 weeks, skeptics were silenced by the undeniable truth of performance charts and returning planes. Pilots across the squadron began to test the tactic, not as a primary strategy of retreat, but as a vital tactical reset. They realized that the Mustang was a ghost that could choose its reality in the sky. If the odds were bad, fuel low, or position compromised, they shoved the throttle forward and disappeared. They used speed to buy time, regain altitude, and re-engage on their own terms when the situation favored them. The impact was not just physical, it was psychological. German radio transcripts from April 1944 began to reveal a disturbing trend of frustration among the Luftwaffe's elite hunters. They spoke of Mustangs that cannot be caught, of American fighters that refused to play the game of circles and accelerated out of gun range. The German air superiority doctrine was built on the assumption of aggressive engagement, and Buholtz had found the loophole that neutralized their fury. This tactical shift merged perfectly with General Jimmy Doolittle's new, aggressive order to hunt the Huns, giving pilots the freedom to utilize their machines to their fullest potential. Loss rates per sortie began a steady decline across the group. Fewer pilots were being swarmed, fewer were running out of fuel over enemy territory, and more were returning to England to fight again next day. Robert Buholtz survived the war, a feat of endurance and logic that spanned 73 combat missions over the jagged, smoking ruins of the Third Reich. When he finally unbuckled from the cockpit of his Mustang for the last time, he was credited with only 2 aerial victories. By the standards of the press and the propaganda machine, he wasn't a hero, he wasn't an ace. But to Robert, that wasn't the score that defined his service. His real tally was written in the silent spaces of the sky, measured in the missions where he didn't die, and in the steady line of wingmen who followed his silver tail and lived to tell their own stories. He never sought the flashy prestige of the kill count or the hollow vanity of the dogfight. He was a creature of the horizon, a man who viewed the air war not as a duel of honor, but as a mechanical problem to be solved with speed and survival. When the guns finally went silent, he didn't hang around the airfields or the officers' clubs. He went back to Iowa. He returned to the corn, the hogs, and the quiet, rhythmic certainty of the earth. He became a man of the soil once more, a man who could listen to a failing tractor engine and know its secret before he even touched a wrench. He kept his medals in a dark drawer and his memories in a dusty shoebox, never speaking of the scorching heat of the Merlin or the red line of the manifold pressure. In 1983, a military historian finally tracked him down in the flatlands. Buholtz was in his 60s then, still possessing the sharp, economical gaze of the boy who fixed threshers. When the historian asked him about that legendary day, he outpaced 12 German fighters. Robert didn't boast. He didn't speak of adrenaline or courage. He simply shrugged, adjusted his cap, and said, "I wasn't trying to be clever. I just didn't see the point in dying when the airplane could go faster." That was the essence of the man. The Mustang could outrun them. So it did. Robert Buholtz passed away in 1996, and his obituary was only a few humble paragraphs in a local newspaper. It mentioned his family, his farm, and his service. But it didn't mention the day he changed the fundamental way American pilots thought about the physics of survival. But the lesson he left behind is immortal. It lives in every cockpit where a pilot understands that discretion is a tactic and that speed is a shield. Robert Buholtz didn't need the glory of the kill to know he had won the war. He had mastered the sky through the cold, hard math of a farm boy who knew that the smartest way to win a fight is to be so fast the enemy never even gets a chance to enter the ring.